Hi, I'm Katie Mackinnon, a PhD candidate at the University of Toronto. Today I'm talking about my research on digital youth and internet culture in the late 1990s to early 2000s, and discuss the development of an ethical framework for engaging with these particular types of materials in web archives. I begin with quantified youth, the idea that young people are made to be data by platforms, and discuss how this relates to digital privacy and data's lingering afterlives in web archives. I want to think here about erasure, forgetting, and persistence. I also provide an overview of internet research ethics as it applies to web archives, followed by an argument for care ethics and some scaffolding that has grown alongside my research for ethical questioning. While I am a researcher who engages with web archives to write about the history of the web, I see too the implications these ethical questions might have for wider discussions about web preservation in general. As we know, over the past 25 years, the web has become an unprecedentedly rich primary source. It's where we socialize, learn, campaign, and shop. All of human life, as it were, is vigorously there. Writing histories about the 1990s to 2020s inevitably involves the web as a resource. Contemporary studies on digital media have paid particular attention to youth participation, cultures, and communities online. The future of historical research depends on the preservation of web materials. For example, research on youth cultures in the late 1990s to early 2000s might look to web communities like GeoCities, which is accessible because of the Internet Archive. GeoCities neighborhoods like West Hollywood or the Enchanted Forest are two examples of unique, incredibly fruitful resources for studying youth participation in the early web, and can be used in a way that gives young voices autonomy and agency. There are, however, significant ethical and methodological challenges in researching and writing about the phenomenon of young people divulging personal details about their lives without the possibility for informed consent, while also accounting for the sensitive nature of these materials and the ways in which computational methods and big data research often fails to anonymize data. Research with web archives on youth cultures should question the regularity with which young people become data subjects through their proximity to social networking sites, either through family, friends, or themselves. Young people's data is subject to commodification, surveillance, and archiving without consent. Researchers engaging with archived web materials have a responsibility to develop better practices of care. In Canada in the late 1990s, online branded playgrounds emerged, seeking to develop relationships between children and products in the form of quizzes and interactive media that encouraged them to divulge personal information in exchange for opportunities to win contests and prizes. Families trusted these brand-safe names like Kellogg's or Coca-Cola and saw no issue with their children interacting with these sites. Despite North American legislators being aware of the potentially invasive relationships between commerce and young people as early as 1996, they also saw the profusion of children's sites as an opportunity to develop economic growth of the web. This balance has been maintained throughout much of web history, despite the growing and continued efforts to mandate age restrictions. The UN Committee on the Rights of the Child has stated that young people have the right to information, freedom, and privacy, which includes the ability to access information, expression, thought, and association. This has implications for researchers who must balance the children's rights to privacy with expression, and should be taken up more deeply in web archives. Growing up online is a relatively new area of research that involves meditations on the impact that a lifetime of data production and online participation has had. Questions of information permanency, reputation, and identity come up often, as the increased discoverability of old data and web materials can place lives and reputation at risk. The conceptual framings of the right to be forgotten and erasure become relevant as we consider the life worlds that are built on the web. The tenor of association between young individuals on these places might have been assumed to be private, small, or safe. The collection and storage of these materials may come to directly affect those who produce them. Archives engage in politics of capture and extraction. Large web collections, like the Internet Archive, contain upwards of 553 billion web pages, many of which were created and maintained by marginalized or vulnerable groups, including young people, and contain a range of personal or sensitive material. Web archiving initiatives and organizations are essentially engaged in, quote, intervening and shaping the availability of information and media, end quote, through the collection practices as access to parts of the web that have been deleted or abandoned by state and corporate owners are restored and provided. This means that despite user intentions, corporate ownership, and platform popularity trends, web archives extend the lives of data as part of the leaky network. Web archives are a reconstruction of web material, not a direct representation. There are many elements of the live web that cannot be captured into the archived version, which means that pages will often look or act differently than they did before once in the archive. Niels Berger has described this phenomenon as, quote, digital-born web material being reborn in the archive. Through web archives, data remains alive. It is visible, scrapable, aggregable, malleable. It is reborn. Marika Siffer argues that the liveliness of archived materials demonstrates how archives are vigorous and changeable, which places emphasis on the creation and development of meaning and translation that are made from archived material. Others have argued that the afterlife of data exists in a state that is made to be independent from the people, places, or processes it came from, which effectively works to flatten the difference between past, present, and possible future. This simultaneous liveliness of the data and flattening of temporality cautions web archive researchers to ground these materials within its own context, against contemporary analysis, and in conjunction with other traditional resources, reminding us that data are not objective or raw, but created and emerging from particular historical, economic, social, and cultural circumstances, and therefore are formed and cooked. New challenges emerge when applying computational methodologies and tools to youth cultures in historical web archives at scale, not only due to the vulnerability of the research subjects, but also the tools used to extract their data. Jimmy Lin and his team survey different ethical frameworks that scholars and system builders have been engaging with to discuss the types of analysis that can and should be conducted. They grapple with the notion that while researchers have the computational tools to scrape web data for many types of analysis, a more pertinent question is whether it is ethical to pursue these types of academic avenues. They focus on content-based retrieval, large-scale distant reading, and user re-identification for research engaged in digital history. They determine that two significant guiding principles are relevant for the development of better practices of care: context, what the original creators expected of the materials, and scale, the conceptual and experiential distance between the researcher and the content creator. Similarly, Stein-Lomberg also references these concepts and asks, how can we ensure that the voluntary sharing of personal data at one point in time does not come to negatively impact the research subject at a later point in time, especially when, quote, researching children, social or politically marginalized groups, and physically or mentally vulnerable individuals entails a great ethical responsibility to protect participants from being bullied or put on undesirable public display, regardless of whether the online activities we study revolve around their vulnerability. The data ethics decision aid also reflects these concerns and provides a step-by-step process through which to orient your data ethics considerations. It's important to remember that big data stretches our concepts of ethical research in significant ways. It moves ethical inquiry away from traditional harms, such as physical pain or a shortened lifespan, to less tangible concepts such as information privacy impact and data discrimination. Further, data science methods create an abstract relationship between researchers and subjects, where work is being done at a distance removed from the communities most concerned, and where consent often amounts to an unread terms of service or a vague privacy policy. In 2014, the Court of Justice of the European Union ruled that in accordance with the EU's 1995 Data Protection Directive, individuals have the right to be forgotten in online search engines like Google. This language was seen again in the EU's General Data Protection Regulation in 2016, which applied the right to erasure to prevent, quote, the indefinite storage and trade of electronic data, placing limits on duration and purpose of the data. It also states that individuals may request that data be deleted should it become irrelevant, inaccurate, or cause harm that is not outweighed by public benefit of retaining the data. This conceptual framing of data materials is not widely accepted, but should carry more weight for internet researchers. In Canada, the University Research Ethics Boards approve research involving humans that abide by the Tri-Council Policy Statement on Ethical Conduct. Internet research that involves humans is not well integrated into the ethics policy, as any conversation or interaction in public has no reasonable expectation to privacy. Because of this, researchers are encouraged to, quote, act a bit like trolls, to take and use whatever and however they want from people's social worlds online, or sex world or political worlds, with no conversation, no consent, and no accountability. In grappling with ethical issues of private versus public, many have turned to Helen Nisenbaum's 2010 concept of contextual integrity. This is an expectations-based framework for ethical reasoning about privacy and the protection of human subjects from harm in digital contexts. Instead of thinking of privacy as a matter of universal principles about who and who should have access to what information in which contexts, Nisenbaum suggests a lens of privacy as contextual integrity to consider whether something must be treated as private or not by looking at the specific context, data, and actors involved. This principle of contextual integrity invites researchers to dwell on the possible ethical consequences of repurposing historical data from the original context into the archive and onto the context of web history. In this framework, the relationship between actors, content, and context are bound together and also invoke the distance principle, which measures the conceptual and experiential distance between the object of study and the person who produced it. Additionally, it is not necessary to have fixed rules that determine all ethically sound research on digital materials because it's impossible to establish protocols that can be applied across all contexts, cultures, and research fields. Rather, a case-by-case approach that follows similar questioning and reflection around procedure, tools, collection, storage, processing, and documentation has been encouraged. The Association of Internet Researchers have developed 3 editions of ethical guidelines for Internet research, which declare that researchers must weigh harms to research communities, balance the rights of subjects with the social benefit of the research, and consider the possibility of increasing the vulnerability of the research communities. It's imperative that we consider whose stories are being told, who is equipped to tell them, and what kinds of vulnerability or harm we might encounter or nurture when doing so. Key to care ethics is activating research with others rather than conducting it upon others. This allows us to envision a different world and challenge taken for granted knowledges by way of situating them in specific historical, sociocultural, material, and bodily contexts. To conclude, I want to turn towards methodology. I developed a preliminary set of questions that have been useful in my own research with web archives that includes and builds on professional standards articulated by AIR, as well as others working in this area. These questions emerge from a commitment to an ethics of care through practices of care for web archive research on historic internet and digital culture and materials. This attempts to reflect a more responsive ethical methodology design that recognizes participants' needs and rights more explicitly. First is to consider researcher relations. This project involves you and who. Consider who is the person, the people, the community being researched. Who are you to them? What is your stake in this research? Through this, we consider who are you bound to? Remembering that data is always invariously attached to bodies, so where are the human subjects? What are the harms and benefits of this research? And how are you engaging in anti-tourism? Next is deliberate use. Work against the temptations of data that prompt us to overinvest in digital personas, fail to recognize human subjects as holding autonomy and authority of data, and who have the right to opt out and refuse to be coded. Remembering that just because we can do certain research doesn't mean we should. There are limits to what data can and cannot tell us. This brings us to limits or questions of access control. Who is the archive for? Who does it serve? What does the archive contain, and what are the gaps in it, and what are its traces? How can we organize this data, and who has control over access? How do we represent refusals? Stopping, hiding, keeping things private? Can we reconsider archives' relationships to extraction and capture? For research on young people, this might specifically mean, is their voice being heard? What story is being told and who is telling it? Is the data being overemphasized? How has the platform impacted the creation, the form, and the preservation of this data? How do they feel about their digital traces? Do they want it archived? How do they want it to be kept? What are the limits they ask for? Do they want to delete their data, keep it hidden, and keep it to themselves? These questions reflect themes of archival refusals or projects that are working towards building limits, barriers, or restrictions to access. The Black Trans Archive, made by animator artist Danielle Braithwaite Shirley, is an interactive game and archive that aims to preserve the stories of Black trans people. Entrance and access to the archive is determined based on your own subjectivity, and non-trans, non-Black visitors must work their way through the game first, making promises and going through experiences to demonstrate their commitment to the mission of the collection, to protect, to preserve, and to support the privacy and security of Black trans people. It actively works against what Braithwaite Shirley refers to as trans tourism or cis people consuming trans bodies. Cassia Adair has written about ethical difficulties in researching and writing about queer and trans young people online in the 2000s in their own research, writing that while archives of queer and trans life and survival are scarce and therefore valuable, quote, there's a significant anti-archival trans politics that have emerged not out of a desire for self-annihilation, but out of resistance to being siphoned up, pinned down by state or corporate collection. On the other hand, Jennifer Webb-McGuans returns as well to this question of who the web is for in her work on the digital bundle, which is defined as, quote, a collection of things regarded as sacred and held by a person with care and ceremony. There are opportunities to redefine the standards within which we create, collect, and care for and research web materials. While we are working with what we have to talk about the past, there are opportunities to build towards an ethics of care for the afterlives of data of the future. Thank you so much for listening. Feel free to reach out through Twitter or email.